It was 5:30 in the afternoon, and I just got home from work to find the house empty. I knew my dad was never home until around 6:30 or so on a weekday, and my brother always went to his friend's house to study until at least 8 or 9. But my mom should have been there like she normally was. She worked part-time at a nearby bakery and was usually home by 3 at the latest. I figured that she'd gone shopping or picked up an extra shift, so I made myself a snack and went to my room to relax and watch a few videos. I was halfway through watching an episode of The Simpsons when I heard my mom's voice calling me from downstairs. I paused the video and opened my bedroom door and peered out onto the landing. I listened for a moment before calling back to her. There was no response, and I couldn't hear any movement or anyone talking, so I closed the door and figured that it might have come from outside. Not even 2 minutes had passed before I heard her calling me again. It was in the same tone and the exact same words as before. I got off my bed quickly and went out onto the landing. I called back down to her, but again, she didn't answer me. I gradually made my way downstairs and into the hallway and stood listening for a few moments. I thought that maybe I'd be able to hear her moving about so I'd know which room she was in, but I heard nothing. I decided to make my way into the kitchen, as that's normally where she'd usually go first to either leave her shopping bags or make a coffee. I couldn't see any bags and the kettle was still cold. I checked the back door in case she'd gone out and taken the trash out or something, but it was still locked. I felt strangely confused and made my way into the living room. She wasn't in there either. I was just about to look out of the window to see if I could see anyone when she called out to me again. But this time it sounded as if it came from upstairs. I couldn't understand how, but maybe she'd gone up there whilst I was in the kitchen. But then why hadn't she answered me? I ran upstairs as quickly as I could in the hope that I might see her. I went straight into my room thinking she might have gone in there looking for me like she sometimes did, but she wasn't there. I glanced out of my window onto the driveway, but she wasn't there either. I then went to my parents' room and knocked twice, but there wasn't any answer, so I opened the door and looked inside. I thought she might be in there putting laundry away or something, but she wasn't in there either. Puzzled, I crossed the landing and knocked louder than I usually did on the bathroom door before opening it. The bathroom was also empty. I'd just gone back into my room and was about to lie on my bed when I heard her calling again. This time I ran downstairs as quick as I could and checked all the rooms again. I still couldn't find her. Then it dawned on me that every time I heard her calling to me, it seemed to be coming from the opposite end of the house to where I was. I don't know why I hadn't realized it sooner, but this had to be one of her pranks. She'd done this to my brother before, and he eventually found her hiding behind the couch. I decided I'd give it one last go and looked everywhere I could think of. I looked behind the couch, and then behind the chair in the corner. I even checked inside some of the lower kitchen cupboards, as she wasn't very tall and had only a slight build, so she'd probably find it easy to get into small spaces. I then looked in the basement and even went out into the back garden just to be sure. Eventually I went upstairs and checked inside the linen cupboard and inside all the wardrobes in both mine and my brother's room, and eventually my parents' as well. I even checked underneath the beds. In the end, I gave up and decided to call out to her. I said, "Okay, you win." I stood on the landing waiting patiently for her to answer, but she didn't. So I called out to her again, but louder this time, asking her where she was. She'd never kept a prank going this long before, and it was starting to annoy me that she was still ignoring me, despite me having played along and looked everywhere for her. I was just about to go back into my room when I heard a car pull into the driveway, flooding the hallway with light through the glass door. Seconds later, my dad hurried through the door. He was panicking and out of breath. I ran down the stairs to meet him. He told me that my mom had been involved in a car accident outside the shopping center near to where she worked, and had been taken to hospital, and that we needed to go there straight away. My brother Josh was already in the car and was crying. He looked up and gave me a quick glance before turning his head away. We spent the next 4 hours waiting to find out how my mom was doing. She'd been taken into surgery not long after she arrived. Later that night, we were told she had passed away shortly after coming out of the operating theater. We were all in too much shock to be able to talk much. It was the first time I'd ever seen my dad cry. On the journey back home, some of what the doctor and my dad had said started to come back to me as I hadn't been really listening at the time. I began to realize that the first time I had heard my mom calling to me was around the same time she'd had her accident. They said that she never regained consciousness and passed away peacefully. Each time I'm alone in the house now, or even in the middle of the night when everyone else is asleep, I listen to see if I can hear her calling out to me. And as much as I'd love to hear her voice again, I never have to this day. This story took place in the late 70s and would be a night I'd never forget. It was December 3rd and I'd just been to see the punk band The Rezillos at the Lyceum in London. It had been an amazing night and my ears were still ringing from the loud music. It was raining and I'd been stood waiting for a bus for around 20 minutes or so when I noticed a young girl walking towards me. She was roughly 100 yards away and was walking alone. I noticed her because she was so young and looked to be no more than 12 years old. It was gone 11, and despite the fact that there were still a lot of people about, nobody else seemed to give her a second look. I thought it strange that a girl so young would still be walking about this late at night on her own. She was getting closer and I wondered if I should approach her and ask if she was okay or whether she was lost. But it felt wrong for a man of my age to go up and talk to her while she was on her own. Without any warning, a man slammed into the back of me, knocking me into the bus shelter. He was drunk and staggered towards a nearby seat. He apologized to me several times. I said it was okay and that there was no harm done. But when I looked to see where the young girl was, she'd simply vanished. I continued to look for her whilst I waited for my bus. The drunken man had staggered off further down the street, and there was only me and one other person left waiting. The bus finally showed up. I let the other person, a middle-aged woman in her late 40s, get on first whilst I took one last look around for the young girl. She was still nowhere to be seen. I tried to think no more about it whilst I got on the bus and paid my fare. The bus was virtually empty, with only 3 people on the lower deck, including the woman who'd got on before me. I climbed the stairs to the upper deck thinking it would be empty, but then I heard voices. A man and a woman, both in their early 20s and not much older than I was, were sat on one of the front seats talking about a movie they'd been to see. I turned towards the back of the bus to sit where I usually sat, and that's when I saw her. It was the same young girl, sitting 3 seats away from the back of the bus. I was confused as to how she'd managed to get on the bus without me seeing her. I thought that maybe she'd turned back when I lost sight of her and got on at the stop before mine. In a strange way, I felt relieved to know that she was okay. I chose to sit halfway along the bus so I could be close to her but not too close as to make her feel uncomfortable. I smiled at her before I sat down, but she offered me nothing back in return and just continued to stare at the seat in front of her. But now that I'd seen her close up and in the bright lights on the bus, I noticed how sick she looked. Her face looked pale and she had a slight redness around her eyes. I thought that maybe she might have a cold or was just tired. I still had a strange urge to speak to her but thought it best not to, and to just keep an eye on her instead. We were about 10 minutes or so into the journey, and I was still keeping an eye on her through the reflection in the front window. I'd noticed how she never seemed to move her head, not even to look outside the window next to her. She just seemed to look ahead all the time, but not looking at anything in particular. She didn't even glance over like most people do when the couple at the front of the bus stood up to get off at the next stop. I kept thinking to myself, why are you out so late on your own? I was genuinely worried about her. 15 minutes or so later, the bus turned onto Cemetery Lane. It was called Cemetery Lane for obvious reasons. There was a large old cemetery about halfway along and was one of the biggest and oldest in the area. I lived about 20 minutes away and had always had a strange fascination about the place. I don't know why, but I felt an odd kind of comfort from seeing the graves at night, where people who once lived were now sleeping. I'd often wanted to visit the graves in the daytime, and read some of the dates and maybe see if I could find the oldest gravestone, but I never seemed to have the time or gotten round to doing so yet. Maybe one day I will. We traveled for another couple of minutes or so before the bus pulled up outside the cemetery gates. This was my favorite stop, as I got to look out onto the graveyard for a little bit longer. Seeing all the graves under a half moonlight makes you realize just how short life is, and that no matter who we are, we all end up in a place like this one day. I looked down to see 2 people getting off and 3 more waiting to get on. One of the people getting off was the woman in her late 40s who had got on at the same time as I did. It had always fascinated me how so many of us share a journey, like passing ships in the night, but we never know who they are or where they're going. I just settled further back into my seat when I heard a child's voice say thank you. It sounded close, almost as if they were stood right behind me.
Thank you.
I spun round and saw that the girl had gone. I stood up quickly and looked around. She was nowhere to be seen. Thinking she might have passed me when I was looking outside, I walked quickly towards the stairs and looked down, but she wasn't there either. I couldn't make any sense of it. How the hell does she keep managing to get past me without me seeing her? I turned to sit back down and then saw her again. This time she was stood in the gateway to the cemetery. She was looking up at me with the same blank expression. She then turned and walked through the open gates. A cold shiver ran the full length of my body as I began to realize what might be happening. I watched with a heavy heart as she walked along the main path before turning off onto the grass and continuing through a mass of gravestones. I continued to watch her until she finally disappeared into the darkness. I sat back down on my seat as the bus began to move again. The whole thing had left me feeling a deep air of sadness that I don't remember ever feeling before. I wasn't sure if it was because I felt slightly responsible for her, even though I didn't know who she was, or because I was beginning to realize what she might be. I went straight to bed as soon as I got home. I lay awake for over an hour thinking about her and who she might be. I just couldn't get her out of my head. The next day I got up early and paid a long overdue visit to the cemetery. It felt strange walking in the exact same footsteps as the young girl had taken last night. I cut across the grass at the same spot I'd seen her take and continued in the same direction towards the far corner of the graveyard. There were hundreds of graves, with a few dating all the way back to the 1700s, and many of them were children. After an hour or so, I decided to give up. It was turning cold and was beginning to rain again. I took one last look around before I began walking back towards the gates. But before I left, I turned and said goodbye, in the hope that she might hear me and take some comfort from the fact that at least one person hadn't forgotten about her. A few weeks later, I went to visit my Nan. I'd not been there long when I brought up the subject of the cemetery by mentioning how old some of the graves were. She went on to tell me how a lot of the graves were from the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic and how it had killed more than 228,000 men, women, and children in Britain alone, and how most of them had died from respiratory failure. She told me that the autopsies would show how the victims would have hard red lungs and be drenched in fluid. It had been nicknamed the Purple Death. Was it possible that the young girl I saw had been a victim of the Purple Death? Or maybe from some other tragedy that caused her to die at such a young age? Either way, I'd probably never know. But every time I passed the cemetery by bus, I'd always look out for her, especially when traveling at night.